Good morning, ministers, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. I very much welcome you to the second Governors Seminar on Connectivity and Cooperation. Without further ado, let me invite the panelists on stage, and the panel session is moderated by Financial Times journalist, Ms. Henny Sender. Panelists, please. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. As an American, I feel slightly embarrassed to be here. It's a source of great sorrow to me that the United States is not a member of the AIIB, but as a permanent resident of Hong Kong, I go to Beijing frequently, and I have watched the AIIB not only grow but evolve. And at this time, when there are so many trends in the world that are not very productive, I think the message of the AIIB and all my panelists is especially important. All of us are here because we do believe in connectivity and multilateralism. We're going to start by having each panelist talk for 5 minutes. And they've chosen topics that have to do with connectivity, but they each define it in their own way, depending on their priorities and interests. And then we'll have an interactive discussion. The last 15 minutes are for me to delegate my job to you. So please think of your important questions. We have 2 Dannys here, and we're going to start with the Singaporean Danny to give us an overview of the trends that he thinks are important in shaping the world going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Henny. Good morning, everyone. I'm here to speak about a macro overview on the Europe-Asia connectivity challenge. I'm an academic. I won't have the insights that policymakers directly at the heart of the bank or in the private sector have. So we will have to wait to share those insights from them. But I want to give you an impression of the macroeconomic overarching overview on the developments here. It has long been the case for international policymakers that the phrase, the global economy's center of gravity, has shifted to the east. Among international relations scholars, foreign policy scholars, there's been a global power shift. About 10 years ago, a paper was published that decided to take those concepts literally and make precise what used to be just metaphor. So someone calculated the global economy's economic center of gravity, and they showed how it had shifted from the middle of the Atlantic Ocean 4 decades ago on its way to a resting point, as perceived from 10 years ago, in GMT +8, in the time zone that cuts through a great chunk of Asia, ASEAN in particular. So it is there that I want to begin my narrative of the macroeconomic overarching overview, because it is in ASEAN that we see a microcosm of the kind of connectivity challenges that we will be encountering going forwards. ASEAN is at the heart not only of this new global center of gravity, it is also where 50% of the world's population sits closely clustered together in the tightest concentration of humanity on this planet. It is a concentration in urban areas that when an urban area is well governed, shows high productivity, producing benefits for humanity, up to 50% per capita higher productivity in well-run urban centers. ASEAN, Southeast Asia's GDP, has been on an upwards tear, not as high double-digit rates as China, but up there. And today, ASEAN's GDP is higher than the United Kingdom's or India's, rapidly approaching Germany's. ASEAN's workforce of over 600 million is the world's third largest. ASEAN, after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, developed a bulwark of resilience so that from yesterday's presentation from Chang Ping of the AIIB, we see that external debt GDP ratios, while they might be gradually rising, are still comparatively low. Credit ratings are high. So it's in ASEAN that, for me, the Europe-Asia connectivity story begins. There are two other points I'd like to make in the time I've got. The first is, how do we build on this cluster of excellence, growth, diversity, dynamism that's emerging in Southeast Asia and Asia more generally? And second, to conclude, what will be the ongoing challenges? So for the first of these 2 points, the connectivity justification has traditionally come from traditional economic ideas about trade and exchange. Connectivity improves the prospect for delivering goods and services across physical space. Connectivity matters, and as Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer from the United Kingdom yesterday mentioned, it is connectivity with the highest standards, quality, not just quantity. And that's a hugely important justification for our thinking about the connectivity challenge. But in closing out this second point I want to make, I want to suggest that there might be a new reason for wanting to be part of this connectivity project. That we want to think about connectivity not just as channels for economic trade and exchange, but connectivity as allowing us to build a matrix of resilience. Standard economic ideas about trade and exchange rely on the two trading parties being different. So in traditional terms, we had differences in what was called factor endowments, capital and labor. But in the 21st century, almost surely, technology is going to overwhelm differences in capital and labor, technology and ideas. So it is still, however, differences across geographies that we need to leverage in building this matrix of resilience. So I want to suggest that the second reason for thinking about connectivity is in terms of knowledge exchange, exchange of best practice, understanding alternative models for economic and political governance, understanding alternative ways in which cities across Europe and across Asia provide public goods. Let me finish up. If that's such a strong, compelling reason, what are the challenges? And in finishing, in closing, I want to suggest just two. There are many that we can discuss, but I want to bring out just two. The first of these is capacity as a bottleneck for local partners dealing with foreign financiers in structuring financial projects and implementing them. Capacity building is something that we desperately need hand in hand with connectivity. My own industry, higher education, I hope comes into the frame because we can provide some of the engine for capacity building. Let me finish. What is the final challenge? The final challenge is trust. Today, the international system sits on the brink of possibly dramatic change. The multilateral rules-based order that so many of us have benefited from the trust that has allowed all of us to place in engagement with the rest of the world is at risk. It is undermined for real economic reasons. Parts of the world see huge challenge in rising income inequality, pessimism, confidence, the idea that their industrial landscapes have been hollowed out. And they, originally the architects of the multilateral rules-based system might be undertaking actions that seem to undermine it. We need to rebuild that. And we can rebuild that in Europe and Asia, not necessarily simply by being alternative architects, but by being concerned, empowered, and articulate consumers of an international rules-based system. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You've given us a wonderful overview. And before I call on you, Mr. Minister, I just want to bring out these themes that Danny mentioned because they are so important. You know, somebody was describing to me recently the debate in China before it joined the World Trade Organization. It's so tempting to believe in self-sufficiency and not trust the world. You know, to abandon self-sufficiency requires a huge act of faith. Will somebody sell me soybeans if I stop being 100% dependent on my own ability to supply that? And trust is very fragile, as you point out. I think that's a great theme, and I want to develop it in our discussion later. And also your points on technology. And where does technology play a positive role? And how do we offset the potential negative effects of it? And how do we reconcile national ambitions and multilateral ambitions? And I think after all these years, ASEAN is finally moving to that kind of coordination. And with that, thank you so much for this great overview. And now, Mr. Minister, I turn it over to you, and all of us thank you for your hospitality in bringing us here today.
Thank you, Henny, and thank you, Danny. It's a nice rhyme here. For your introductory speech, which is really humbling me because I would have really preferred to speak first.
I think Danny has set a really high bar.
Exactly. So I can promise you I will run below the bar.
Slightly alarmed as the last speaker.
I promise you I'm going to lower the level. I think I'm going, while listening to the first Danny, I wondered what I should say as introduction. I'm going to say three things. I'm going to talk about how to deliver connectivity. I'm going to speak a little bit of governance, and then speak a little bit about financial services, because that's an area where Luxembourg is really well known and connected with the rest of the world. Now, on how to deliver connectivity, as we are in the AIIB setting here, I think in a kind of simplistic way, we might all think we're going to put fiber all over the place from Europe to Asia, so build things so that everybody's connected. Well, it's natural to think that way, but I'd like to throw in, just for our thinking here, the following now. It is connected to Luxembourg by chance, but it's not a Luxembourg topic. There is a company based here in Luxembourg called European Satellite Company, which operates the Astra satellite. So they operate 65 satellites, which for the time being are mostly used for television programs, for direct broadcasting. But data transmission is becoming more and more important. They have launched a huge program to deliver data to 3 billion people on the planet that have no connectivity. And suddenly you realize, oh, infrastructure doesn't need to be on Earth. It can be in space. And it's probably far less expensive if you can beam out and up the data instead of laying cables and fiber optics and whatever technology is available. So I just wanted to throw that in so that we realize when we talk about infrastructure and investment here, it can be maybe in space. The other thing I want to say about how to deliver connectivity, two things that have struck me in the last couple of years, and you're going to think this guy, he's just fetching things that have nothing to do with our topic, but I think they have. It's the refugees coming from all over the world, and they all have a cell phone. If they wouldn't have a cell phone, they wouldn't find their way. And they all have a cell phone. So in Africa, those who came from Syria, and there's refugees all over the planet, and they seem to find connectivity wherever they go. So in a way, connectivity must be available one way or another already. And my third point is China, where I go on a regular basis. When you go in a restaurant, everybody pays with his cell phone. So isn't that connectivity for financial services, for payment? So I just throw that in to connect these dots with all the things that have been said. Governance and risks that are, linked with the issue of connectivity. How do we manage that? Obviously, can only be managed multilaterally. It is managed in a way through surveillance, through national countries, cooperation through countries. It has also military implications and so on. But then also for business, we need to guarantee the connectivity, and this is a big challenge. And last but not least, yes, financial services is probably one application where connectivity is taking place already every day. If I take Luxembourg, take the investment fund industry, which is second to none apart from the United States in Luxembourg. So we have $5 trillion under management here. That money is invested, comes from certain countries, goes back to those countries. So this is all digital, this is all connectivity. If I take, for example, China, 80% of European investment funds that invest in mainland China are Luxembourg ones, 30% worldwide. So if that is not interconnectedness and connectivity that already exists, we just probably don't see it that way or do not understand that it is a connectivity of which we don't even think about anymore. We're taking as for granted without knowing how it works. But in the end, how it works, and that was how it is delivered, is a theme for engineers. The governance issue is a theme for governments. And the impact it has on the economy is obviously the challenge for enterprises.
Mr. Minister, thank you so much for that overview. You know, we will also pick up on your parallels of physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure. I thought for a moment you would start talking about other planets. You know, I was listening to an interview with Jeff Bezos, and he started this NGO called Blue Origin, which I find deeply disturbing because he says we're definitely going to use up the Earth. And rather than slow it down, I really don't care. I want everyone on Earth to buy everything that Amazon offers, but I'm going to go to another planet where life will be habitable after we all destroy the Earth. I also, will come back to financial flows, and your point about I had no idea how many of the flows that go to China come through Luxembourg, but we will talk about patterns of financial flows and how we can improve them, and that's something I want to come back to with you. And now it's my pleasure to turn to my fellow resident of Hong Kong. When I was talking with the AIIB about this panel, I said I would like at least one private sector person with practical experience. We're all talking about connectivity on a high level, but Sean is the one who physically builds that connectivity and has to navigate the landmines of local standards, local protectionism, local content. Talk to us about the challenges that you see in connectivity.
Thank you very much. Our business really relies on connectivity and cooperation. I come from a very different industry. My company, AECOM, is one of the largest global infrastructure design engineering consultants. When I say infrastructure, we design and engineer, highways, roads, tunnels, port, airport, bridges, new towns, and buildings. So. In reality, 40% of our global design engineering business are from Asia Pacific, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So how to collaborate and cooperate is key for the success of our business. For example, when we deliver our high-speed rail design engineering in Singapore, we have to work with our team from Spain, and our team from UK, and Australia, Hong Kong, and then nevertheless the Singaporean local team. So how to build this very solid, communication to deliver a good product is really critical for our success. But, in theory, that's the ideal situation. But in reality, day to day, we run into different challenges. There are institutional constraints, technical challenges, and then geopolitical risks. When we say institutional constraints, that's basically we're really facing different laws and regulations, labor law, tax laws. We're talking about different fee scales. And we have to be very careful to send a world-class bridge engineer from London to work on the project in Mumbai. We cannot burn our fee, if we're not careful. And then also it's very, very critical to look at different countries' national and cyber securities. And then interestingly, when we talk about very high level connectivity, one bottom line is really the language, the translations. We all know that loss in translations, but it happened on a day-to-day basis.
From a legal point of view.
Or from the project point of view, contractual communication, how do we communicate effectively? And then, for example, there's a story about a journalist asked Volvo's CEO, he said, "You're a global company. What's your official language, right?" And he said, "Our official language is broken English, right?" So I think that's it's very true in a way. And how do we communicate effectively and in a different culture, And then technical, we're talking about the digital infrastructure is very different in different cities, different countries. We're talking about the building codes, even the environment standards, environment codes are all different. How do we work in a different environment to achieve the consistency of the global standard? And last but not least, the geopolitical risks. We're talking about change leadership, elections, change government. It happens all the time for a company like us. It's very, very unpredictable. Last year, the election in Malaysia, and the major infrastructure project canceled or postponed. That caused a business like us a lot of difficulties. And then the other thing is really natural disasters, typhoons, tsunamis, fires, cause our work postponed, delayed. It's really hard to manage our design or engineering resources to work with this. With all these risks and challenges, but we have to, as a global business, we have to overcome these hurdles. And how do we do that? Fundamentally is really work together in a very transparent way. You have to have very clear transparencies with different teams, and it's not only about share the gain, but really share the pain. That's very, very important. We all understand we're on the same boat. If we we sell together. If we sink, we'll sink together. So that's a fundamental attitude. For the technical capability is really about continue to the upgrade and elevate our tools. That is very important, particularly, the technology is moved so fast. And then how do we continue to do that? And then the build a good data bank to exchange the knowledges and to make sure the quality of our work is consistent. Doesn't matter it's in Mumbai or in Singapore. It's has to be consistent. And last but not least, because the design engineering is all about people, right? So the people is the most important assets. How to train them and how to cultivate them. It's not only on the senior, junior, but even or the middle level, and give them a clear career path, and also respect the local solutions
and then local cultures have a sense of a pride and have a sense of the cultural authenticities, and that's very, very important to the success of our business. And thank you.
Sean, thank you so much. I'm going to come back to you, and one of the things I want to ask you about in the future is, we're all on the verge of 5G, and 5G means the Internet of Things, smart cities, a whole different way of planning, and how you think about that in the future. So please be thinking of that.
About that later.
And now it's my pleasure to call on you, Dr. Zeddy, and hear about how you define connectivity, which will add a whole new dimension, because you live in a world of soft connectivity as well as hard physical connectivity.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel. I just wanted to say, for us in Asia, especially Southeast Asia, we saw globalization and connectivity from the beginning of time, especially with Europe, because we were the center of trade between the East and West that came to our part of the world. And now, of course, we are seeing two important regions like Europe and Asia. We are both amongst the most diverse, and perhaps Asia is even more diverse in size and stage of development and every aspect and systems. We are diverse, and yet we have come together, but we have chosen a different path. Europe was unification, whereas in Asia and Southeast Asia, it is integration. And but we have the common objective, and the common objective is a shared prosperity. And so with that, I just wanted to say that the nature of I should add that it started off with ASEAN, and now, which Danica has mentioned, but it's now become ASEAN +3. And ASEAN +3 includes the big countries. That is, the greater Asia includes China, Japan, and Korea. And how have we done? It is our integration. It is through and build this connectivity amongst us, and then with us and Europe and the rest of the world. It is building the physical infrastructure, of course, and then what I want to emphasize, which I have been very much involved in, is the financial infrastructure within Asia, and to build our connectivity amongst ourselves and the rest of the world. And the third channel is through sharing and cooperation, really, on many fronts. And now we have seen great successes. 50% of our total trade is with each other, and there's greater cross-border regional investment flows as well. And there's now greater financial flows within Asia. And this is important because it has contributed to greater stability in our financial markets, because unlike before, where you have flows from developed countries into our region, now it is from our region into our region. And so it they're more stable flows. But more important aspect of it is all of us are surplus saving countries. And therefore, most of our investments used to go out to other parts of the world, in particular the developed world, but now it's recycled and rechanneled some part of it, and potential to finance, for example, infrastructure investment and so on, as we have more developed financial markets. So this is a more recent phenomenon, and this has resulted in a mutually reinforcing outcome for the region. Now, let me turn to the question that has been put to me regarding the other connectivity, and I'd like to focus on the people-to-people connectivity and the human and social connectivity, which is also very important. And this arises from strengthening the knowledge networks and contributing to increased potential of a country. And you talk about capacity building and the knowledge, and the most important asset actually we all have is the people, the talent that is needed. Without that, we can have all the most magnificent infrastructure, but without the people, it's not going to materialize and be realized. And how we have done it is there's now, of course, we are seeing greater mobility already within Asia. People work in each other's countries, invest in each other's countries, and this gives the greater mobility of people. But there are now new platforms to share knowledge, centers of education, that is, universities are collaborating and setting up campuses in each other's countries. We have important platforms and for exchange of ideas. We have research institutes that share information. We have many recognized researchers, and then students exchange, which Europe has, and which is very successful. And then public sector exchanges as well that that are fostering exchange programs. We have business associations and networks of chambers of commerce and so on. All these, and this is very vital because it contributes to enhancing understanding about different cultures and values that prevail, especially for businesses. And our speaker here did mention Malaysia in particular. We had a change in government and how challenging that was for some businesses. But I would like to say that the focus of the government, and when I look at them, the one thing after 1 year having presence, they have a lot of challenges. They are a period of Malaysia is facing a period of transition, but one thing that they decided to do is clean up. So we also look for private sector to assist us in that process because we want the highest standards, the best practices being adopted in these projects. And therefore, businesses must demand for that transparency and demand for that high standards of doing business so that governments would not adopt any irregular practices that has a high cost later on. And so it's finally that I just want to add that a major challenge confronting emerging economies is the building of this capability. And just like building physical infrastructure, it's really key to enhancing the potential of a country. And I just want to conclude with one example of the experience, and it's in the financial sector, how we have collaborated within the region very effectively, and this, I hope, gives assurance to those who want to be part of Asia that we have resilience of our financial systems. And it's because we've come together and had the standards and the practices, and we have strengthened every aspect of building resilience of our financial sector together and collaborating to do that. And we have the apex of it is global, and I must give mention because I believe that they have a great role, and that is the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS, where the central banks meet every 2 months. And I did that for 16 years, actually, in Basel, where we exchange ideas. There's a sharing of identifying of risks and so on, and sharing of experience of the different policy options that we have before us to generate that resilience and effectiveness. So within the region, we've come together in capacity building, in central banks, cross-border liquidity management in central banks, and we have a regional financial safety net, which is the largest after Europe. And then we've developed an integrated crisis management system framework that within less than an hour, we can all come together because we leverage on technology and what we have to resolve any crises, imminent crises that may be triggered, to ensure the stability of the Asian region. This has indeed contributed to the stability and resilience of the region. Thank you very much.
Perhaps the BIS should move to Luxembourg, but we can talk about that later. But I want to thank you so much for those remarks. And we'll come back to the point that, you know, your point about the financial systems have become so much more resilient and robust by having capital flows staying in the region. I think that is such a critical point, and it just makes things so much more healthy. And I just want to add a personal note here that, and we'll come back to it, but I think a world in which there's only one reserve currency and that country uses its payment system in very questionable ways is not a good world. And, you know, I rejoice that we see this integration and financial flows now not being recycled through the developed world. Before I turn to you, Mr. Minister, I loved Sean's comment about broken English. And I spent years in India as a student, and I go to Malaysia or Indonesia, and I think, oh, I understand so much of the language. Why? Because so much Hindi comes from Turkey, from Arabic, from Persia. It's in India, and then it's there. So, you know, your point about language and uniting people and the human capital coming to countries outside their own is so important. And one of my friends used to be the US ambassador to Afghanistan, Kurt Eikenberry. And he says, you know, you cannot compare the US-Russia Cold War with US-China. Why? Because there are 300,000 Chinese students in America. That kind of human relationship can so effectively diffuse tensions, right? Mr. Minister, you're at the heart of a lot of tensions in the world today. Tell us how you see the connectivity to overcome those tensions.
Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be in. Also, a very great experience to be with such a distinguished panel. First of all, I think you made a comment about language, and one of the things that we forget is that how much, if we look at all languages, how languages are connected, and that's the part of human interconnectivity, and language being one of the most cultural elements, we sometimes do not give that credit. I think there were many great comments about interconnectivity, and very simplistically, the way that I can understand it is if you look at tactically adding 1 + 1 is 2, adding 1 + 1 + 1 is 3, and so on. But when you look at it as a connectivity, it's 1 + 1 is 11, 1 + 1 + 1 is 111, and so on. So really, when you talk about interconnectivity, the growth is geometric rather than mathematical. And that's really the power of networks. That basically is the kind of world that we're living. There's a comment from Ray Kurzweil, one of the renowned futurists in Silicon Valley, and his comment was that in the 21st century, the growth that we'll experience in knowledge and everything is equivalent of what humans have experienced in the prior 30,000 years. So that really, I think it comes from the whole aspect of networks and where we're going. I think our colleague from Luxembourg talked about the role of Luxembourg. I see a lot of similarities between Afghanistan and Luxembourg. We're only, like Luxembourg of 1840 in terms of war-torn, economically challenged. But also in terms of the connectivity, and we were part of this, the road of the Silk Road for many millennia, where 4,000 years ago our lapis lazuli used to go from Afghanistan all the way to Cappadocia and Egyptian Middle Kingdom. And in fact, if you look at many of the historic tablets that has been excavated, It's in 3 languages. It starts with Aramaic, continues in Sanskrit, and ends in Greek. So that, there you go, that for us, the interconnectivity has been part of our DNA. And it's only in the last 150 years, with the growth of the maritime, we became landlocked. But where we see the potentiality is, especially with the book of the Cold War and whatever, and the growth and the rise of Central Asia, and with South Asia, we really see ourselves that critical link of connecting these 2 areas. It's true that Eurasia has more than half of the world population, but if you look at Central Asia, South Asia, we're looking at 30% of the world population. So we are that critical link in that aspect, and very much like how Luxembourg served for Europe. And we see tremendous opportunities and great changes in the last several years. We really see potential of these growths both in the area of movement of goods, movement of energy, and movement of data, which I'll come back to. I think the great leadership changes that happened in Central Asia, especially in Uzbekistan, President Shavkat Mirziyoyev has really had a great vision of interconnectivity, and we really see these days the Central Asian countries are looking south to connect more to South Asia and the Gulf. Also, we look at South Asian countries, and especially with the election of Prime Minister Imran Khan, we see a unique opportunity. So I think we should really try to utilize in this unique window of history that could really be foundational for the next decades to come. I'll just give a couple of quick examples. If you look at energy, for instance, the complementarity of Central Asia, South Asia is so important. Central Asia has more than 30 to 50,000 megawatts of additional energy capability, which South Asia could use. South Asia, having a quarter of the world population, having only 1/20 of the electric generation base. So there lies the tremendous opportunity. In terms of data, half of the world interconnectivity is from Europe to Asia. The current routes take 130 milliseconds. This terrestrial route through Afghanistan that and where a small part is left, it will reduce 30 to 40 milliseconds. Of course, data packets every millisecond mean $100 million of savings. Similarly, in terms of goods of Central Asia and South Asia, the complementarity is quite a bit, as well as the food security links of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, for the Gulf countries. We see these ones as tremendous areas that we would like to talk about. And I think through these opportunities, there's tremendous areas that all of these countries can benefit, and this is where we really see a part of win-win for the region as a whole, and becoming a base of stability where we have been part of one of the hearts of challenge for the region and the area, but we could really be that pivotal point of stability and growth and economic improvements for the region and reduction of poverty for that part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to come back to some of the issues you raised. And I loved your point about energy, so I want to come back on that. And, these things are all about, will the evolution of relations and connectivity be competitive or cooperative? And that's one of the critical questions. And now it is my pleasure to finally turn to you, Sir Ali Zerdani, and give us the last words of the opening remarks.
Okay, thank you, Henny, and it's great to be part of this very distinguished panel, and particularly with Pierre Gromagna, our Chair of the Board of Governors and host today. It gives me a chance to thank you again for the wonderful hospitality that we have from Luxembourg. I want to bring you a message of hope, if I may, because sometimes when we talk about... Take 10 minutes, she says. Okay, great. That was easy. Sometimes when we talk about multilateralism in these days, we have a tendency to feel negative, that there's a lot of threats, and you're right that there's a lot of challenge in the world right now. But we're here at the AIB annual meeting. later today, we'll have our Board of Governors meeting, in which we will, all being well, admit another 3 members, 3 African countries, to join our bank, bringing the membership of the AIB to 100 countries in 3.5 years of the institution. I mean, that's actually quite a remarkable thing. For a world in which multilateralism is supposedly in recession, that there are 100 members around the world who've chosen to get involved in a new multilateral venture to achieve a common goal, says something about the enduring value of multilateral cooperation as the best way to solve common challenges. And so, as long as the chair does his job, at lunchtime today we'll have 3 more members in our bank, and who knows more to come. I wasn't sure, Pierre, if when you were talking about satellites you were going to start pointing the direction for the next membership expansion of the AIB, but we can see the way that it's going, and this is important because for the type of challenges that we're talking about in this panel of connectivity, of building the infrastructure connections, the roads, the railways, solving some of the problems that Sean referred to of regulatory differences and political differences in order to enable those projects to go ahead. I think particularly important is the international energy connectivity that Mr. Kayumi referred to. If we want to solve the challenge of climate change, taking renewable energy from Central Asia to the consumers of South Asia so that they don't have to generate so much from coal or fossil fuels and can use renewables instead. Again, that will rely on having infrastructure connectivity. Multilateralism means that the countries who come together in an institution like AIB, they define a set of common objectives. That's what we have. AIB's objective is to finance infrastructure projects that support the sustainable economic development of Asia. And secondly, to promote international cooperation to support that objective. They agree a set of rules, a set of common norms and standards. For the AIB, the language has been referred to. We only have one language. Thankfully for me, that language is English. For most of our members, that means we're communicating in a universal common second language, which presents challenges, but also does facilitate good communication. But having common rules, standards, frameworks means that you move away from a situation in which might is right and whoever is strongest gets their way, and instead everyone is involved in shaping the way that an institution like the AIB works. So, Luxembourg, Afghanistan, as well as China and France and Germany and the UK are just as involved in deciding what should be the policy, what should be the direction, what should be the focus of an institution like the AIB. And as we develop our institution, we then have to work out in a very practical way what are the sorts of things that we can do to support infrastructure investment and connectivity. We've been discussing that a lot in the course of this in this annual meeting. And I'm sure we'll come back to it because it's been raised by other panelists. But I just wanted to say also that if we want to assure a strong future for multilateral cooperation, then we also have to recognize that as well as continuing the things that have been important in multilateral cooperation since the Bretton Woods institutions were founded, and particularly having strong governance, high standards of governance, having strong and high standards for the way we do our business, we also have to accept some changes, that there are going to be different sources of leadership in this world. The AIB, 75% of our shares are owned by Asian countries. We are an institution that was proposed by China, where China and India are the 2 largest shareholders, where Asian countries provide a lot of the leadership, but also Europeans provide a lot of the leadership too. We have to expand our cooperation not only among member countries, but with the private sector too. The scale of the infrastructure gap in Asia is so enormous, and these figures are debated, but the Asian Development Bank suggests that the infrastructure financing needs in Asia is something like $1.7 trillion per year. Our $100 billion of capital sounds like a lot, but in the context of that challenge, it's a small amount of money. But where we have an opportunity through example, through leadership, and also through mobilizing private capital to contribute much more broadly to meeting that challenge. So I think multilateralism is crucial to solving the connectivity challenge because it enables countries to work together to define common ways of solving those problems, deal with some of the issues that Sean raised, and of course provide finance for projects in countries like Afghanistan which sorely need them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You had the last word on the first round, Sir Danny, so I want you to take the first word on this coming round. You know, as I was thinking about this panel, I thought, you know, how do you think about a development institution today? And it seems to me that the greatest contribution of the AIIB is because by definition, you're incentivized to think in terms of multilateral. But you are dealing with representatives of countries who have much more incentive to represent national interests. They're politicians, they have to get elected, and they think in terms of election cycles, where the big challenge is to think in much longer terms. Infrastructure is long term. It doesn't lend itself. How do you go about giving that sense of a different kind of incentive structure to your members as people?
Well, I was a politician before I became vice president of the AIB, so I don't totally accept the characterization that democratically elected politicians are incapable of thinking for the long term.
I wasn't
albeit,
that.
albeit
I
that
didn't say it that strongly.
It's a common criticism in some places. I mean, I think that in a sense, the point I was trying to make earlier is that the answer to that question lies in the fact that despite some of those constraints, those same leaders have come together to say, we want to create an institution in the AIB, which by its very nature has a long-term goal. Right? The AIB hasn't been set up to do things to satisfy 5-year time horizons. We're thinking about what is the infrastructure that Asia needs over 30 years? Yeah. How do we support our members to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement, which is looking ahead decades? How do we invest in the kind of infrastructure that Asian countries will need, not just 1 or 2 years ahead, but 10 or 20 or 30 years. And that does also mean thinking through the challenges of new technology. What kind of infrastructure will be needed in a few decades' time? And then it means using the governance structures we have to form shared views about those things, but based on the fact that we're a rules-based institution. So we have ways of doing that everyone buys into. And then in the end, look, we're investing in projects that will repay over 20 or 30 years. And so that's a long-term commitment. But having the commitment of an MDB, a AAA-rated institution that can provide finance over that period at a reasonable cost, helps in itself to incentivize people to think about how can we develop our projects so that we can access that kind of finance with the other benefits that brings.
I think it's also important to find a balance between resolve the short-term needs and then long-term needs, because particularly in Asia or Southeast Asia, there's still major shortage of basic infrastructure. Are we going to fulfill all the basic, or we need to find a balance, digital infrastructure as well as the basic infrastructure in order to have a balance? Because if you only focus on the short-term needs, that really may cause a lot of waste of resources in the long run.
Dr. Zeddy, I'm going to turn to you, and then I'm going to turn to you, Danny, because I see you scribbling away. I mean, you have always lived in a kind of schizophrenic world with representing Malaysia, but living in a very multilateral world. And yet you're very optimistic today that you can reconcile these things. Talk to us a little more about it. And, many years ago, so many of us just despaired. ASEAN was just an artificial construct, yet it has become real.
Yes, well, because we discuss the common goals that we want to achieve, and all of us know that many of these require collaboration and work cooperation in order to achieve it. Many of us are small countries, and on our own we will not be able to. We live in a region where there are 4 large countries like China, India, Japan, and Korea, and the rest of us are all very small countries. So we discuss at length what is it that as a region we want to achieve, and in the different parts of the region, like the part that I was involved in, we want to create an environment that is stable, that is conducive for businesses and others to participate in, that they have security, efficiency, and soundness and standards and predictability of the systems. And therefore, this is how we align ourselves and harness our energies within the region to deliver that.
Thank you. Danny, and then Mr. Minister.
Henny, I thought that I could bring back some of the questions you raised earlier, if you wish, and then I also had a question for Sir Danny.
Please.
And that has to do with trust in the multilateral system. Because we know we've had a good run of 6 decades of a multilateral, inclusive, rules-based order. And it was great that we were able to build the institutions of the international financial architecture, the older institutions under it. AIIB and the newer MDBs, newer multilateral institutions, are coming into being at a time when, yes, we shouldn't be all pessimistic about the situation, but we also need to be realistic that the traditional support for that international system might no longer be as strong as it used to be. And that traditional support used to take the form of, with the US, you get international rule of law, but the way America describes it, with the other guys, you get the might is right, arbitrary exercise of power. So the question is, it seems to me, Sir Danny, when you tell us about the good possibility for multilateralism, the new form of leadership that we need, it seems to me, we need to continue to spell out still. It's still a work in progress. And whether it's a leadership that's going to come from the newly emerging great powers, or it's going to be a flatter world where all small states and all non-aligned states and all people who want to share peace and prosperity get together and be the joint leaders in that kind of institution. It seems to me that AIIB is well on its way to telling us that kind of story, but it'd be great to hear your vision for leadership going forwards. That would have been my take on your point about trust, Henny,
Thank
and
you
what
so
I heard
much.
coming from Sir Danny.
Mr. Minister.
Yes, I'm very glad to be able to come in at this juncture. I had not mentioned multilateralism in the introduction because I thought it wasn't obvious, and I mentioned it obviously very much in my speech yesterday here. This is key in connectivity, multilateralism. Now, I share Sir Danny's view that we are too pessimistic in how we view the state of play of multilateralism. And even though we need to be realistic, we must continue to advocate it and just talk about it and demonstrate what multilateralism has done over time, what it is delivering today, and what it can promise and deliver tomorrow, which unilateralism and nationalism cannot. Now, we are faced with that in all countries. I mean, if you look at European Parliament elections in Europe a couple of months ago, we had that debate at European level of extreme parties, both left and right, very often, not always, being negative about the European Union. And yes, they gained some percentages, but by and large, you can say that 3/4 of the EU population has voted for parties from left to right, with green parties in the middle, that support the EU integration. And if you allow me, being here in a country who is a founding member of the EU, in fact, on Kirchberg here, where we have a large part of the EU institutions, including European Investment Bank, I must underline here that what we have achieved up to now as the European Union is unparalleled. I know ASEAN quite well myself. I've worked with those countries when I was a diplomat, and I still follow how ASEAN is progressing. But it is obvious that the kind of cooperation and integration that we have already achieved at European level is incredible, is really incredible. I'm going to mention just a few things. I'm not going to elaborate. Banking union. coming from the financial crisis, I know and I'm glad that there are emergency situations through the Basel International Settlement Institution, through regional agreements, you can help each other. But it's a kind of ad hoc cooperation which might work or might not work. Now, the answer of European Union, banking union, is we have a common umbrella. And everybody said when we started the discussion back in 2010-11, oh, you're never going to agree to it. This has never been done. We did. GDPR, data protection, which is absolutely key in the connectivity debate. And again, I'm not going to elaborate, but you all realize how important that is. To agree on that is so complicated. Is so difficult. So I say if it is difficult for us who work together on a day-by-day basis, I don't want to imagine how difficult it is to agree on that at the world stage. But then again, take climate change, where we have agreed.
Let's get to that in a minute.
So I finish on multilateralism,
yeah.
just to say there are different degrees of cooperation, and the AIIB is a ray of hope because it's the newest kid on the block, and 100 countries are supporting it. And I'm sure there are going to be other multilateral efforts in areas that I just mentioned, because we just need it, otherwise the connectivity will not work.
Thank you. I want to talk about finance, so I'm going to turn to you in a minute, Dr. Zetti. Sure, go ahead.
I'll be very quick, but I think it's a great question. Look, I think that I would say, firstly, within the AIB, you see a very high level of trust among the countries who've chosen to, and the members who've chosen to take part. And you're right that there are new sources of leadership, but there's also many European countries involved, for example. And that's why we're here in Luxembourg. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to, for our vision, is to build a very strong institution that is recognized as having very high standards of governance, in which all the members, large and small, are able to take an active part and be involved in shaping the direction of the institution. It means having very high standards in terms of how we do our business. It means being very transparent about the decisions we make and what we're going to do. You've heard this a lot. It means being lean, clean, and green. It means being efficient, ensuring that we respond also to other signals of global leadership. So I take two, the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are both commitments that every single member of the AIB remains signed up to. And so we also have to respond properly to those signals that our leaders give us in terms of the direction we need to take.
Thank you. I want to talk a bit about finance, then I want to talk a bit about the environment, then I want to return to the question of human, then I want to turn to the audience. But so I want Dr. Zetti and then you, Mr. Minister, to comment on this one issue. It seems to me, and I don't know if you all agree, but that one of the impulses behind deglobalization was the global financial crisis, which actually started out in the US. It started out as a US financial crisis and quickly was transmitted to Europe and then the rest of the world. So my question to you is, how do you build a more robust global financial system so that a crisis which started in the US and infected the whole world can't happen again?
Right. Well,
Don't say yes. Don't say yes.
no. A crisis will likely happen from time to time. Over 30 years, there have been about 100 financial crises, and each manifests itself in a different form. And what is important is to recognize eminent signals, and risk management is very important, and that's what we discuss all the time. What can go wrong? And then the next thing is to be in a state of readiness, and this is where cooperation and exchange of ideas and discussion. So we look at how can we be in a state of readiness in having resolution regimes and how we can collaborate to address these issues and so on. And therefore, we can minimize or contain a crisis and minimize its implications. And I want to say, maybe it's unkind to say, but we don't use the word global financial crisis, because actually our part of the world in Asia and Asia Pacific, including Australia and New Zealand, were not experiencing a crisis.
A wonderful point.
So because we had reformed and restructured and did all the painful adjustments, and therefore we were able to withstand it. So
And you learned from the Asian financial crisis
learned
10
from
years earlier.
Yes, and we did everything possible to be in a state of readiness. So yes, we were affected by the repercussions of the crisis, but we were not in a state of financial crisis. And so when now they use the acronym GFC, and for Asian financial crisis, AFC. So I mentioned this point in Basel, and somebody suggested then it should be called the Great Financial Crisis, not the Global Financial Crisis. But
Thank you. Duly noted. Oh, sorry, did I cut you off?
Oh, I will be brief because I had already touched upon it. You see, the answer of Europe was much deeper in terms of institutions. But again, if you ask me the question, will we avoid a similar financial crisis at world level? Can we guarantee that 100%? The answer cannot be yes. It would not be responsible by a politician, by a central banker, by a finance minister to say, we have seen all the risks and we have covered them all. It would be not responsible to say we haven't done anything, which is not true. We have done a lot. To tell you the truth, and this is connected with connectivity, the next financial crisis, in my opinion, will be triggered by cybersecurity. And many recognize that there's a huge risk there, and we're investing a lot. All the countries are investing a lot, cooperating on this to make sure that it doesn't happen. But it could happen, to what extent and so on. And I think it's always important to be humble and know you have fixed some issues, then the crisis comes. I mean, you throw one crisis out of the window, another one comes in through the door. This being said, it's again an example, cybersecurity, that tells us we can only solve this multilaterally. Everyone in his corner will not solve it. Now, a digital or cybersecurity issue will basically block all the e-commerce and all the financial flows. Now, I don't even want to imagine what that means. It is like a power shortage on the whole planet. So now, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but you see that by digitalizing everything, we become totally dependent on that. I have rarely heard, for the time being, someone saying, how do we have a redundancy system to all of that? Now, if you take power, people have a generator at home. And you know, when there's a power shortage, you put on the diesel engine, and 9 times out of 10, that engine that hasn't worked for 30 years doesn't work. So, you see, there are issues out there that are very threatening, but at the same time, the financial crisis has delivered a lot more cooperation and multilateralism, also with the United States, because the consequences hit everybody.
That's such an excellent point. I feel very strongly about environmental issues. I know that there were 2 discussions yesterday on the subject, but it seems to me that one of the most important roles of the AIIB today is focusing on the crisis that I worry about the most, which is the water crisis. My fear is that countries like Pakistan and your country, Mr. Minister, may well be the first that run out of water. How hopeful are you that countries will resolve this in a cooperative way rather than in a unilateral way? This is the biggest tension facing your part of the world.
If I make just a quick comment on cybersecurity, and I'll come back on this. I think cybersecurity, absolutely, I totally agree with them, with the minister. I've been attending the Munich Security Conference for several years, and unfortunately, rather than finding a way that everybody work together, there is a sense of hopelessness, which is absolutely, this is one of those elements of the tragedy of the common, that every major country is an intruder as well as a victim. And unless we look at it as something that is part of, very much like the environmental issue, that it's something that it will affect any and all of us, I don't think we can really solve it. And I hope that kind of a spirit of cooperation really develops to solve this issue. Now, in terms of water, contrary to your belief, I think Afghanistan is one of the countries that in terms of water, we're blessed with tremendous resources. In fact, we are the upper riparian for 5 of our 6 neighbors, except China. Now, having said so, we are in part of the world that the water, we are seeing major environmental changes. Afghanistan, again, one of our dichotomy is that we are a country with the smallest carbon footprint, yet one of the countries that has been most affected by the environmental issues.
Can you give some examples?
Yes, I'll do that one. For the last 30 years, our average temperature has increased by 1.5 degrees Celsius. Southern part of the country has increased over 2 degrees. Our snow caps melts 3 weeks sooner than it used to. The frequency of droughts and floods are becoming far more frequent. Things that used to happen every generation is happening every 2 or 3 years. So we see the environmental issues to be a major factor. I think part of it is that, that in terms of water, how all of the countries look at a way on how they can work together, collaborate, and really, the demand side management of water is not something that many people have taken very seriously, and they look at it as very much like oxygen, that is a God-given right. But what is really happening, if you look at it historically, from 5,000 years or more, the biggest and the vicious wars that we have had in the world has been wars around water. This is going to continue. And if you look at the last 30 years, in our part of the world, if I look at it, Central Asian countries, the amount of precipitation for the last 30 years has actually seen an increase. Pakistan, Afghanistan, these areas, has remained the same. Iran has seen a decrease. India has seen a decrease. Arabian Peninsula has seen a major decrease. But what has happened even in our part of the world is because we used to get water more in terms of snow and ice, so the snow cap was our reservoir. Today, that's not really the case. It's mostly coming in the liquid form. So rain harvesting and other approaches, and also recognizing that the water is a common good, that how we can really help, and this is where the use of technology comes into effect on water harvesting, on the new forms of irrigations and whatever that's, and then the connection of that to the IT systems, environment, weather patterns, and electricity comes, it's very much interlinked. One example of that in terms of, if I look, we talked about energy and green energy. A neighbor of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, has, is blessed with 4% of the hydropower potential of the world. Yet in one of their plants, Nurak, every year they are wasting 1 billion kilowatt hours of electricity. Not that they would like to waste it, because of the fact they do not have a use or a link to use it. While in, next to Afghanistan, Pakistan, for instance, Faisalabad, with the largest area for textile, 2014, a $10 billion operation. 2014, their income dropped by $4 billion because of lack of electricity. So for a lot of these kind of issues of environment, energy, and economics, the interconnectivity networks is what's going to be our future.
Fantastically interesting. Sean, you want to add something, and then I want to go back to Sir Danny.
Also about, again, come back to my industry, is the infrastructure. For example, the Chennai in India, right? They have drought, but they also have flood. The entire system's infrastructure is not supporting how to deal with the flood and how to retain, when there's flood, how to retain some of the water. It's not there. Sometimes it's an ecosystem. When the ecosystem broke down, the entire system screwed up. You know, we see this in Southeast Asia, Philippines, all these rain, flood, but then at the same time, they're still looking for clean water, you know. So this is a much bigger issues, and we have to deal with and work together.
You know, I met a Canadian company, and they have done work in KL. And there's an underground highway, I was told, and it becomes a water storage area when there are floods and the sewage system can't absorb it. So I was thinking, Sir Danny, you know, that one of the great things about the AIIB is to diffuse technology and these interesting ideas that you see in one of your member countries to other member countries.
You're absolutely right. It's a critical role for AIB and indeed for other multilateral institutions is to share knowledge and experience among member countries. And actually, the example that Tan Sri Zeti gave earlier about the Asian financial crisis is a really interesting example because under her leadership and others in Southeast Asia, they made changes to their regulatory systems that protected them from the great financial crisis. Yet we in Europe and elsewhere didn't learn those lessons. And actually, if we'd learned those lessons back then, we would have been in a better position to deal with the challenges that came in 2008. And it's an interesting example where the knowledge transfer didn't happen. And so I think institutions like ours have a responsibility. Where you find an innovative project in one country, we're in China, we're financing a project in Beijing, which is to help reduce air pollution around in the Beijing area. Lessons from that could be transferred to other countries, which also face those air pollution challenges. The point that the minister made about electricity transmission is absolutely critical on a cross-border basis. There are all these power generation resources in Central Asia which could help to solve economic and climate challenges in other parts of the world. And so finding ways to develop that cross-border infrastructure that's necessary is a critical role for institutions like ours, and then to share that in other circumstances. So I totally agree with your point.
We were supposed to end at 10:30. We started 10 minutes late. I still want to end reasonably close to time, but I wonder if there are any questions for the audience. And I can't see, so please stand up. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chen Weihua, China Daily. I have a question. I mean, the topic today is Asia-Europe connectivity through cooperation. But the headline we read often is about geopolitical rivalry. Whenever China builds anything in Asia, Africa, Europe, it's to increase China's influence. Whenever US, Europe, or Japan builds anything, it's to counter China. I want to see how much sense this headline make to you guys, and have they have any impact on your work and decision making, especially for those of you who are government officials, or is that just fake news? Thank you.
So what you're really asking is, to what extent is everyone a hostage to the tensions between the US and China?
Not really. I mean, but because I think this is all, good about the win-win cooperation, but it's often interpreted as a zero-sum geopolitical game. So what's your response? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Who wants to take that?
I can give it a first try, maybe others want.
And then I'll ask you, Danny.
Yes, I think what you've described is really too much black and white. I'm not contradicting you in the sense that we are observing such situations, but I want to give you one big counterexample, which is that because of the trade tensions that the United States has with Europe and that the United States has with China,
With everyone, really.
well, but trade tensions are extremely meaningful with those two areas. What have we seen? Well, we have seen China and Europe aligning on defending free trade. Now, who, as free as possible trade, I should say, who would have imagined that a couple of years ago? So this is a major issue, and that is a horizontal one. So yes, there are realignments, and so we cannot portray the whole relationship between China and Asia on the one hand, maybe, and Europe as being as controversial as you say. I would dare say that in the last couple of years, that relationship has strengthened. Europe is making more and more free trade agreements have happened also in the recent past, one with Japan, for example. And I believe that we have an axis here of countries that want to work together more. And the AIB is exactly about that. It's totally complementary to that. And with this answer, I don't want to deny that there are other elements in it, but one shouldn't put it in black and white. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to add anything? Danny.
Could I just
Sure,
add
Danny.
something to this? I think that it's very interesting in the world right now. There's a lot of focus on connectivity and infrastructure investment in Asia. And that's a real opportunity for the region if you can find a way to harness all these different initiatives to a common goal. You know, there's the European Commission has an initiative. There's the work that multilaterals like ours do. There's the Belt and Road Initiative. There's the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. If those things can be harnessed together, then the potential to realize benefit to Asia is really high. And if they become a zero-sum geopolitical competition, then that would be a huge missed opportunity. And the answer, I think, lies in the application of good governance and the type of processes that we have in multilateral institutions. If projects are delivered in a way that is open and consultative and to high standards of the kind that the AIB would implement, then that ensures that you get the best for the recipients, which is what should matter most, as opposed to investing in projects that are poorly chosen or politically motivated or badly constructed, which in the end, because they produce an adverse public reaction, actually undermines what we should all be focused on, which is how do we get the most investment we can into the type of infrastructure that is necessary to deal with the challenges that the panel have been talking about.
And to Mr. Minister's point, there's opportunity cost as well when there isn't that cooperation. So lack of power in the Pakistani Punjab means loss of income, which we don't really know how to measure completely, right?
The biggest part of it is that, you know, in terms of a poverty, you know, an agenda to eradicate poverty or looking at sustainable development goals. These are the ones that suffer. I mean, we use them, and you know, but we do not talk a lot about it. I mean, one other area of energy that I wanted to talk about, if you look at western part of Afghanistan in terms of the wind energy, we have potential of 50 to 70,000 megawatts. The only other part of the world that has the same wind speed is coastal Scandinavia and Greenland, in the middle of a very arid area. Potential of this is how it can really help Central South Asia. It can help even in the Gulf in terms of their energy portfolio that they're looking for green energy, as well as even going west towards Iran and all. So I think that, you know, unless we look at, you know, whenever we try to look at within a national border any problem, the solutions we come up are suboptimal. When you look at a bigger region, the solutions become more optimal. So part of it is where we really define our system. And if we define it large enough, that's where we can get solutions that will be win-win for everyone.
Thank you.
May I?
You wanted to add something, Danny?
Could I step in as well on the question of geopolitical rivalry and the zero-sum perception of a zero-sum nature to the great game out there now? I think there are observers who theorize about the world in terms of a mechanical Thucydides trap kind of way, that it is difficult for the established superpower to accommodate rising powers. And that doesn't have anything to do with identity, it's just the nature of the geopolitical game. And certainly when we look around the world, there seems to be a lot of evidence that drives us in that direction. The US-China trade conflict is just one of them, but the way that some parties continue to suffer, suffer in this globalized world. They have legitimate economic concerns. America has legitimate economic concerns. But at the same time, the rest of the world also needs to get a say in this. There still needs to be brought out the idea that there's a court of global public opinion. And in that court of global public opinion, I think the rest of the world is well aware that, for instance, in the domain of 5G technology competition, there are parties in that conflict who are using the apparatus of the state to try and determine outcomes in a way that should be left to the discipline of the marketplace. All of this is just to say that there is an interpretation that some observers have of the world that are consistent with your observations. But I think there's a lot of the world that's optimistic, continues to believe in the multilateral system, and we can hope that in this court of global public opinion, the right outcomes that lead to greater productivity, peace, and prosperity for all peoples will emerge. And I am optimistic in that direction.
We have time for one more question only, if there's one quick question from the audience.
Sahel Jaffer from Luxembourg. Just a very quick question. I think AIIB is an excellent example of cooperation between Asia, Europe, and Africa is not mentioned, but I think as Africa as well. The question I have is, how can we create a sustainable network for three things which were mentioned by Dr. Zaidi, the Afghan minister, Mr. Pierre out there, which is innovation, research, and talent, and the ability to identify the replication of success in one market or territory to another part of the world. I think that's what we need, a sustainable network, which is actually sharing the research, the innovation, and I think it'll be a win-win for Asia and Europe. And I go back to the Afghan minister's example of 1 + 1 + 1 is 111 in the geometric progression. Thank you.
Arithmetic. Thank you. Sir Danny, do you want to say anything as the last word?
Well, I'm not sure what the answer to your question is, to be honest. I mean, institutions like ours can play a role in the areas that you've mentioned, and especially in innovation. I think multilateral development banks have a really crucial role to play in identifying the new technologies that can be effective and sharing them rapidly among member countries. And actually, in that respect, Asia has some advantages of being able to leapfrog straight to the best new technology rather than having to repurpose existing systems in a way that is highly expensive. And I just wanted to pick up on one other point, because you're right, on this panel we're talking about Asia and Europe connectivity, but from the AIB's point of view, we have members in Africa, we have members in Latin America. Connectivity across the whole world, including in those regions, should be part of our agenda too.
Danny, just one last quick question for you. When we gather next year, what should we talk about next year? What will be the big challenge next year?
You know, I'm told never to make predictions, especially about the future. So I'm not going to do that.
Just a quick comment in terms of the question. I think innovation absolutely is going to be one of the key drivers, but how we can really be able to find ways to connect individuals from the parts of the world that are not as connected. And I think this is where because many of their ideas could be so fresh and are not impacted by a lot of the paradigm paralysis that we have in a linear thinking that has been prevalent in the last century plus. And this is where I look at education. In many of the educational systems, when I look at things such as MIT edX that is in over 200 countries, when I look at many of these other systems that has been developed in China, it has been developed in South Asia, in India, there's SWAYAM systems and others. I think this is where hopefully maybe AIIB can provide ways that the linking of the knowledge systems in education, I think it's going to be the way that could really move the world and move it to a very interconnected and a much more prosperous world.
You know, as the moderator, I'll just take the last word. And you mentioned MIT. So many of my most brilliant friends from China went to MIT, and they thought of themselves as geniuses. They get to MIT, they take the course in electrical engineering, and they get scores like 70 or something like that. But because it's graded on a curve, it turns into 100. MIT put that test online a few years ago. 2 students, one from India, one from Mongolia, got perfect scores. MIT brought them to their campus in Massachusetts, gave them scholarships. And this shows the power of connectivity and technology for opportunity. Thank you all so much. Thank you for my panel. You made my job such a pleasure. Thank you all for your attention. The next panel starts at 10:45.